Okay, so I was only 12 in 1997, but I will also go back to my student years as a starting point. So I arrived in the UK from Canada for my PhD in 2010, which was, of course, the last year that the Labour Party was in government, and I was studying the history of the British left. And as a PhD student studying the left, you have opportunities to engage with a lot of kind of policy circles. And throughout that time, I think a really central preoccupation has been to define the party against the legacy of New Labour. So under Ed Miliband's leadership, that took forms like the rhetorical appeal to one nation Labour, the kind of communitarianism of Blue Labour, and a very cautious reintroduction of the word socialism into the party's PR. Under Corbyn, of course, this took a more radical vision, the form of a more radical vision of economic renewal, and some would say an unpatriotic foreign policy. And while very different, both visions really sought to differentiate themselves from a sort of a New Labour that's portrayed as technocratic and divorced from the Labour tradition and marred, of course, by a foreign policy disaster. And since 2017, I've been teaching the history of the British left at City University of London, where I'm now a lecturer. And what's striking to me is how my students, a very significant proportion of whom come from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, first-generation immigrant families from London, consistently clamor to give their presentations on New Labour and on the Blair legacy. And for these students who were born after the Iraq War and raised under a vicious austerity regime, and of course in the shadow of Brexit, New Labour now represents something much more neutral than it did, I think, for people in my own generation. So I do think that we stand at a point where we can in some ways reclaim the legacy of New Labour in a positive way. Now, of course, any attempt to revisit the legacies of New Labour today must face the radically different economic and political landscape of 1997 and 2022. And it also needs to, I think, understand the complexity, the richness and the ideological diversity that characterized the New Labour tradition. So I found David Miliband's speech today really fascinating in showing the diversity of that project. So, you know, he cites voices who are associated with the left as much as the right, from Eric Hobsbawm to his own father's critique of parliamentary socialism. And Column's own work has really highlighted the extent to which New Labour was formed from a real diverse array of forces and really should not be understood through the caricature that has now emerged of New Labour as this kind of, I guess, capitulation to Thatcherism or as a kind of crude neoliberal project. Even Miliband earlier spoke about this idea of labourism, or New Labour as a critique of labourism, which was really interesting insofar as that was actually a critique that motivated actors like Jeremy Corbyn and the New Urban Left in the 1980s. So there's actually a lot of continuity there that I think can be reclaimed. So it's this diversity that I hope can be recalled today as the Labour leadership still seeks to steer what is still a deeply factionalized party. How am I doing for time? Pretty good. Okay. Going forward with diversity, I think, is key. I also think that in order to look forward and learn from the legacies of New Labour, the party needs to squarely face, combat, and reframe the toxic narrative of regional and class division, narratives of left behind and red wall, espoused by media and political scientists alike, which have allowed the Conservative Party to successfully claim that they have cornered the working class vote. This story really constructs the working class as homogeneously male, heterosexual, and white, and really overlooks the reality of an increasingly female workforce in the service sector economy and a more ethnically diverse working class than ever before. In many ways, it has a lot in common with the labourism that New Labour sought to reject. And it's a narrative that divides people like my students who are so keen to do their presentations on Blair from many people in this country with whom they fundamentally have more in common with than not. So going forward, Labour should embrace the ideological diversity that characterizes and has always characterized the party. The last 12 years in opposition have been riven by factionalism, but every Labour government has been able to integrate the ideas and the insights from different factions, whether this be the Attlee government integrating the ideas and insights of the interwar period, or the New Labour platform, which, as we've just seen, was much more ideologically complex and diverse than I think it is often given credit for. New Labour should be, going forward, Labour should be inspired not by a caricature of what New Labour was or what we think of it as being, but by its complex, contradictory, and sometimes even quite radical legacies. Thank you.